The green blip on radar screen 14 flickered once, twice, then disappeared entirely. Rebecca Chen's fingers paused over her keyboard as she stared at the empty space where Flight 847 should have been. The Boeing 737 carrying 156 passengers from Denver to Miami had vanished from her screen at 32,000 feet, somewhere over the Arkansas-Tennessee border. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tower, this is Rebecca at approach control, she said into her headset, her voice steady despite the ice forming in her stomach. I've lost contact with American 847. Last position was grid 77 Alpha, flight level 320. The response crackled through her earpiece with practiced indifference. Copy that, Rebecca. Probably just a transponder glitch. They'll pop back up. But Rebecca Chen knew better. In her 8 years working air traffic control at Memphis International, she had developed an intuition about aircraft behavior that went beyond standard protocols. The way Flight 847 had been tracking, the slight deviation from its filed flight plan in the minutes before it disappeared, something was wrong. She was the kind of person others overlooked, even in the high-stakes world of aviation. At 32, Rebecca's slight frame and quiet demeanor made her nearly invisible in the male-dominated control tower. Her colleagues often spoke over her during briefings, dismissed her concerns as overthinking, and credited her successes to luck rather than skill. But tonight, as storm clouds gathered over the Mississippi Valley and her radar screen showed gaps where planes should be, Rebecca's quiet voice would prove to be the difference between routine and catastrophe. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd ended up in a career built on communication when she'd always been more comfortable listening than talking. Growing up in a small town outside Portland, Rebecca had been the middle child in a family of loud personalities, her older brother destined for law school, her younger sister already performing in local theater productions. Rebecca found her sanctuary in the basement radio room her father had built, where she'd spend hours listening to air traffic communications, fascinated by the precise choreography of aircraft movement guided by invisible voices. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her path to air traffic control had been unconventional. After earning a degree in meteorology from Oregon State, she'd planned to become a weather forecaster. But during a summer internship at Portland International Airport, she discovered that her unique combination of weather knowledge and spatial awareness made her exceptionally good at anticipating aircraft needs. She could read atmospheric conditions like a book, predict wind shear before it appeared on instruments, and visualize three-dimensional traffic patterns in her mind with startling clarity. The Federal Aviation Administration had fast-tracked her through their training program, and she'd quickly earned a reputation for smooth, efficient traffic management. But her quiet confidence was often mistaken for uncertainty, her careful approach labeled as indecisiveness. In the hierarchy of air traffic control, where bold personalities and quick decisions were valued, Rebecca's methodical style put her at odds with the prevailing culture of Memphis International. Was her third assignment, and she'd hoped the busy hub would finally give her the platform to prove her abilities. Instead, she'd found herself assigned to the overnight shift, managing the quieter periods when most of the airport's leadership was home. Her supervisor, Bill Morrison, was a 20-year veteran who'd made it clear from her first day that he viewed her as a temporary placeholder until a more experienced controller became available. Chen's got the book smarts, she'd overheard him tell a colleague during her second week. But this job's about making split-second decisions under pressure. We'll see how she handles it when things get real. Tonight was about to test that assessment in ways none of them could have imagined. The storm system moving across the region was more complex than the forecast had indicated. Rebecca had been tracking it for hours, noting the way it was intensifying. As it moved east, developing the kind of cellular structure that could spawn sudden microbursts and wind shear. The National Weather Service's latest briefing had classified it as a moderate weather event, but Rebecca's analysis of the pressure gradients and temperature differentials suggested something more severe was developing. She tried to raise her concerns during the evening briefing, but Morrison had cut her off before she could finish her assessment. Weather Service says moderate conditions, that's what we planned for, he'd said with finality. We're not paid to second-guess the professionals. But Rebecca was a professional too, with specialized training that her colleagues seemed to forget. Her meteorology background gave her insights into atmospheric behavior that went beyond standard air traffic control training. She could read the subtle signs that instruments might miss, recognize patterns that suggested developing hazards. As she monitored her assigned sector, Rebecca found herself tracking not just aircraft positions but the evolving weather conditions around them. The storm was moving faster than predicted, its intensity increasing as it fed on the unstable air mass over the warm Mississippi River. More troubling, she was seeing evidence of wind shear development at multiple altitudes, exactly the kind of condition that could turn routine flights into emergencies. Flight 847's disappearance was the first concrete sign that her concerns had been justified. The aircraft had been flying through an area where Rebecca's calculations suggested severe turbulence was developing. When the radar return vanished, her first instinct was that the plane had encountered wind shear severe enough to affect its transponder signal. She immediately began trying to re-establish contact, adjusting her radar parameters and attempting to raise the flight on emergency frequencies. Around her, other controllers continued their routine operations, unaware that one of their aircraft had gone missing. The culture of the control tower discouraged panic, but it also sometimes prevented the kind of urgent response that emergencies required. American 847, Memphis approach, radio check, Rebecca transmitted, her voice professional despite her growing anxiety. Silence. She tried again, this time on the emergency frequency. American 847, if you can hear Memphis approach, please respond on any frequency. Still nothing. Rebecca's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the flight's information. The Boeing 737 had departed Denver on schedule, carrying 156 passengers and crew. It was being flown by Captain Michael Torres, a veteran pilot with over 15,000 hours of experience, and First Officer Sarah Kim, a skilled aviator Rebecca had worked with on previous flights. Both were competent professionals who wouldn't simply vanish without a trace, unless they were dealing with something beyond their control. The weather radar showed the storm system intensifying exactly as Rebecca had predicted. What the National Weather Service had classified as moderate conditions was rapidly evolving into something far more dangerous. She could see the telltale signatures of microburst development, the kind of sudden downdrafts that could slam aircraft into the ground. With little warning, she needed to alert her supervisor, but Bill Morrison had stepped away from the control room for his regular coffee break. The evening shift supervisor, Janet Walsh, was handling another sector and seemed overwhelmed by the increasing complexity of the traffic flow. Rebecca found herself alone with her growing certainty that Flight 847 was in serious trouble. Her training told her to follow protocol, alert the supervisor, initiate search procedures, contact the airline. But her instincts, honed by years of studying weather patterns and aircraft behavior, told her that time was running out. If Flight 847 was dealing with severe weather conditions, every minute of delay could be fatal. She made a decision that would have significant consequences. Instead of waiting for Morrison to return, she began implementing emergency procedures on her own authority. She contacted the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center to initiate search procedures, alerted nearby aircraft to watch for emergency transmissions, and began coordinating with adjacent control centers to track any aircraft that might have strayed from their assigned routes. The response was swift and professional, but it also attracted attention from her colleagues. Controllers from other sectors began asking questions about the emergency procedures she'd initiated. Word spread quickly through the tower that Rebecca Chen had declared a missing aircraft emergency without supervisory approval. When Morrison returned from his break, his expression was thunderous. "Chen, what the hell is going on? I've got 3 different departments calling me about emergency procedures you initiated without authorization." Rebecca turned to face him, her resolve strengthening even as her stomach churned with nervousness. "American 847 has been missing from radar for 12 minutes. I've initiated search procedures per FAA Protocol 7110.65. You don't initiate anything without clearing it through me first," Morrison snapped. "This is probably just a comm failure. Or transponder issue. You're creating a panic over nothing." But Rebecca's weather analysis was proving accurate. The storm system was developing exactly as she'd predicted, with wind shear conditions that exceeded the National Weather Service's forecast. Other aircraft in the area were beginning to report turbulence, and 2 flights had already requested deviations to avoid the worst of the weather. "Sir, I believe the aircraft encountered severe weather conditions," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite Morrison's obvious anger. "The storm system is more intense than forecasted, and I'm seeing patterns consistent with microburst development." Morrison's face reddened. "You're a traffic controller, not a meteorologist. Leave the weather analysis to the professionals and stick to your job." The irony of his statement wasn't lost on Rebecca. She was a meteorologist, with specialized training that made her uniquely qualified to analyze the conditions affecting aircraft in her sector. But the hierarchical structure of the control tower meant her expertise was often overlooked in favor of seniority and conventional authority. As Morrison berated her for overstepping her authority, Rebecca's attention was drawn to her radar screen. A new contact was appearing at the edge of her sector, an aircraft flying without a transponder signal, moving erratically at low altitude. The flight path was consistent with an aircraft in distress, possibly attempting an emergency landing. Her heart rate spiked as she realized what she was seeing. The unidentified aircraft was moving toward Memphis International, but its trajectory was wrong for a standard approach. It was flying too low, too fast, and on a heading that would take it directly into the path of other aircraft. Rebecca's mind raced through the possibilities. If this was Flight 847, the crew was dealing with an emergency that had knocked out their transponder and possibly their radio. They were attempting to reach Memphis, but without communication, they couldn't coordinate with air traffic control. Worse, other aircraft in the area were unaware of the emergency, creating the potential for a mid-air collision. She had seconds to make a decision that could affect hundreds of lives. Morrison was still lecturing her about proper procedures, unaware that the situation was about to escalate beyond anything their training had prepared them for. Other controllers were focused on their own sectors, trusting that the missing aircraft was someone else's problem. Rebecca realized that she was the only person in the tower who understood the full scope of what was happening. Her weather analysis had predicted the conditions that led to Flight 847's emergency. Her radar interpretation was identifying the aircraft's distressed approach. And her understanding of the traffic pattern around Memphis made her uniquely positioned to prevent a catastrophe, but taking action would require her to exceed her authority again, to make decisions that could end her career if she was wrong. The culture of the control tower didn't reward individual initiative, especially from someone already on thin ice with management. As she watched the unidentified aircraft continue its erratic approach toward Memphis, Rebecca faced a choice that would define not just her career, but her understanding of what it meant to be a professional in a system that often valued conformity over competence. The radar blip continued its dangerous path, and Rebecca knew that in the next few minutes, she would have to decide whether to follow protocol or follow her instincts. The lives of everyone on that aircraft, and potentially hundreds of others, depended on what she chose to do next. Morrison's voice faded into background noise as Rebecca focused on the developing emergency. She had trained for moments like this, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of making life-or-death decisions while being told she didn't have the authority to make them. The quiet voice that had been dismissed and overlooked was about to become the most important sound in the Memphis International Control Tower. The storm was intensifying, the missing aircraft was approaching, and Chen was running out of time to prevent a tragedy that would change everything. Rebecca's hand moved to her radio transmitter before her conscious mind had fully processed the decision. The unidentified aircraft on her screen was now 12 miles out, flying at 8,000 feet and descending rapidly, far too low for a normal approach to Memphis International. If this was Flight 847, Captain Torres was attempting an emergency landing with damaged equipment and no radio contact. "All aircraft in Memphis approach control," Rebecca transmitted, her voice cutting through the routine chatter. "We have an emergency aircraft inbound from the northwest. All traffic maintain current altitude and heading until further notice." Morrison spun around, his face flushed with anger. "Chen, what are you doing? You can't ground all traffic without authorization." But Rebecca was already pulling up the airport's emergency response protocols on her secondary screen while simultaneously calculating wind speeds and runway conditions. The storm system she'd been tracking was producing dangerous crosswinds on the primary runway, and the emergency aircraft's approach angle suggested the crew might not be aware of the wind shear developing at low altitude. Delta 429, turn left. Heading 090 and maintain 4000, she instructed a commercial flight that was on a collision course with the emergency aircraft. Traffic alert, emergency aircraft 12 o'clock, 6 miles, altitude unknown. Memphis approach, Delta 429, came the immediate response. We have the traffic in sight. Looks like he's in trouble, no lights, very low altitude. Rebecca's heart hammered as confirmation came through her earpiece. The aircraft was definitely in distress, and now she had visual confirmation from another pilot. She turned to Morrison, who was reaching for his radio to countermand her instructions. Sir, that aircraft is going to collide with inbound traffic. If we don't clear the airspace, she said firmly. I can see 3 potential conflicts developing. You're creating a situation that doesn't exist, Morrison snapped back. This is exactly the kind of overreaction that gets people fired. But even as he spoke, the radio crackled with urgent transmissions from multiple aircraft reporting the emergency plane's erratic flight path. Rebecca's decision to clear the airspace was already preventing the mid-air collisions she'd anticipated. Emergency aircraft, Memphis approach control, Rebecca transmitted on the international emergency frequency. If you can hear this transmission, rock your wings. She watched her screen intently, and after several seconds, the radar signature showed a slight deviation. The aircraft had waggled its wings. Communication was possible, even if they couldn't transmit. Emergency aircraft, Memphis approach. We have you in sight 12 miles northwest of the airport, Rebecca continued, her voice steady and professional. If you are experiencing radio failure, rock wings twice for yes, once for no. 2 wing rocks appeared on the radar. Emergency aircraft, are you Flight 847 from Denver? 2 wing rocks. A collective intake of breath filled the control tower as the full scope of the situation became clear. Flight 847, missing for over 20 minutes, was attempting an emergency landing with no radio contact and possibly other system failures. Rebecca's mind raced through the emergency checklist, but she was also calculating factors that weren't in any manual. The wind shear conditions she'd identified earlier were intensifying near the airport. The runway crosswinds were approaching the limits for a Boeing 737. And most critically, the emergency aircraft was approaching from the worst possible angle. For the current weather conditions. Flight 847, the active runway is 18 right, but wind conditions are hazardous, she transmitted. If you can accept runway 36 left, rock wings twice. Better wind alignment for your approach. The aircraft immediately adjusted its heading toward the suggested runway, confirming that the crew could hear her instructions. But as Rebecca watched the flight path develop, she realized they were facing an even more serious problem. United 738, a Boeing 777 with 298 passengers, was on final approach to the same runway from the opposite direction. The crew, focused on their own challenging approach and the deteriorating weather, was unaware of the emergency aircraft converging on their position. United 738, Memphis approach, immediate go-around, climb and maintain 3000, turn right. Heading 090, Rebecca commanded. Memphis approach, United 738, we're on short final in heavy weather, the pilot responded. Request confirmation for go-around. United 738, emergency traffic, execute go-around immediately. Rebecca's voice carried an urgency that cut through any hesitation. The United flight began its climb just as Flight 847 appeared on the horizon, its landing lights barely visible through the storm but clearly on a collision course with where the United aircraft had been seconds before Morrison finally grasped the magnitude of what was happening. Jesus Christ, he muttered, reaching for the emergency phone to alert airport operations, but Rebecca was already 3 steps ahead, coordinating with ground control to position emergency vehicles and calculating the best approach path for the disabled aircraft. Her weather analysis told her that Flight 847 had perhaps one chance to land safely, and it would require precise timing to avoid the worst of the wind shear. Flight 847, wind shear reported at 400 feet, she transmitted. When I give the word, increase your approach speed by 15 knots. Do you understand? Rock wings if affirmative. 2 wing rocks confirmed the crew's understanding. Rebecca watched the aircraft's approach, her years of weather study allowing her to read the atmospheric conditions in real time. She could see the microburst developing ahead of the aircraft's path, a sudden downdraft that could slam the plane into the ground. But there was a window, a brief moment when the wind patterns would align favorably. Flight 847, increase speed now, 15 knots above normal approach speed. The aircraft's ground speed increased noticeably on her screen. Captain Torres was executing her instructions with precision, trusting her guidance through conditions he couldn't see but she could predict. The Boeing 737 descended through the dangerous altitude zone, buffeted by turbulence but maintaining control. Rebecca held her breath as the aircraft passed through 500 feet, then 400, where the worst wind shear was developing. "Come on," she whispered, watching the radar signature and mentally calculating the wind vectors. At 200 feet, Flight 847 encountered the edge of the microburst. The aircraft's ground speed fluctuated dramatically as it fought the sudden downdrafts, but Captain Torres's skill and Rebecca's early warning about the wind conditions allowed the crew to compensate. The tower erupted in cheers as Flight 847's wheels touched down on runway 36 left, the aircraft rolling safely to a stop where emergency vehicles were already positioned. 156 passengers and crew were safe, pulled back from what could have been a catastrophic accident, but Rebecca's work wasn't finished. The weather conditions that had nearly claimed Flight 847 were affecting other aircraft in the region. Using her authority as the controller who had successfully managed the emergency, she began issuing warnings to flights throughout her sector about the severe weather conditions she'd been tracking. All aircraft in Memphis approach. Control, be advised severe wind shear reported at multiple altitudes. Recommend deviation south of current storm system. Her warnings, now backed by the dramatic proof of Flight 847's emergency, were heeded immediately. Over the next hour, 12 aircraft diverted to alternate airports rather than attempt approaches through the dangerous weather. Her early identification of the storm's intensity prevented what could have been multiple weather-related incidents. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what had occurred. Flight 847 had indeed encountered severe wind shear, exactly as Rebecca had predicted, which had damaged multiple systems including their radio and transponder. Captain Torres later testified that Rebecca's precise guidance during the approach had been critical to their survival. "She positioned us perfectly for the runway alignment and warned us about wind conditions we couldn't see," he told investigators. "Without her guidance, we would have attempted the approach at normal speed and likely wouldn't have made it." The National Weather Service's post-storm analysis confirmed that Rebecca's weather assessment had been more accurate than their own forecast. The storm had intensified beyond their predictions, developing the microburst conditions she had identified hours before they became apparent on conventional instruments. Morrison faced disciplinary action for his dismissive response to Rebecca's warnings and his attempt to prevent her from managing the emergency. The investigation found that his interference had nearly prevented the successful resolution of a life-threatening situation. 6 months later, Rebecca Chen was promoted to approach control supervisor, becoming the youngest person ever to hold that position at Memphis International. Her success led to changes in how air traffic control incorporated meteorological expertise, with controllers receiving additional training to recognize and respond to weather-related hazards. The story of Flight 847 became a case study in aviation schools across the country, highlighting the importance of individual expertise and professional judgment even when it conflicts with established hierarchy. Rebecca's quiet voice had proven that competence and careful analysis were more valuable than seniority and conventional authority. She established a mentorship program for new controllers, particularly women entering the male-dominated field, emphasizing the importance of trusting their training and speaking up when they identified potential hazards. Her approach became known as the Chen protocol, a systematic integration of weather analysis with traffic control that has prevented numerous weather-related incidents. The young woman who had once been overlooked and dismissed had become a respected leader in her field, proving that the most important qualifications for managing emergencies were knowledge, judgment, and the courage to act when lives were at stake. On quiet nights in the control tower, when the traffic is light and the weather is calm, Rebecca sometimes reflects on that storm-filled evening when everything changed. She thinks about the 300 passengers on Flight 847 and United 738 who went home safely because someone was willing to listen to the quiet voice of expertise over the loud voice of authority. Her father's old radio still sits in her apartment, a reminder that communication isn't just about speaking, it's about knowing when your voice matters most and having the courage to use it when everything depends on being heard. In a profession built on precision and split-second decisions, Rebecca Chen had proven that sometimes the most powerful tool isn't advanced technology or years of experience, it's the willingness to trust your expertise and act on it, even when everyone else tells you you're wrong. The storms still come, but now when Rebecca identifies dangerous weather patterns, her colleagues listen. And in control towers across the country, a new generation of air traffic controllers learns that expertise comes in many forms, and that sometimes the person who sees the problem most clearly is the one whose voice has been the quietest. Flight 847 had been just another routine evening flight until it wasn't. And Rebecca Chen had been just another overlooked controller until the moment when her knowledge, courage, and quiet competence saved hundreds of lives with a single radio call. That changed everything.